thank you for writing this book. It's been when I first contacted you, I hadn't read it, and I read the synopsis. I thought, oh, that'd be a good fit, yeah, for us, and obviously, it is. So, question one, get right to it. You said this has been with you for a long time. So why? Why did you write this book, and why now?
Why did I write this book? Well, I mean, short, simple answer is I met her in the 80s. I was very involved in the peace movement, and I was an activist, and I was sort of a Canadian version of what was happening in Germany. And what was happening in Germany at that time affected me deeply, just as I came of age in my early 20s. And I was one of those people who just said, I've got to stop whatever I'm doing and fight against the nuclear arms race. Very much, and I'm sure we're going to get into this, as people are doing with climate change now. You hit a kind of global crisis that intersects your own personal life, and you have a choice. Am I going to engage with that global crisis, or am I going to continue on? Or what am I going to, how am I going to allow this enormity of what's happening to affect my daily life? So and long story short, I got very involved. We had Petra Kelly come out to the End the Arms Race Coalition that every year organized the huge walks for peace out in Vancouver. I was the coordinator. I met her personally. I met the general. I was swept up by her vision, which was so much larger than the vision we had in our, peace movement out here in Vancouver. I mean, just the interconnections that she made between peace and ecology and human rights and Tibet and sexual freedom. And, she was a vast thinker, and she just wove it all together. And so, yeah, I was very moved by that. And then years later, I became a novelist. It wasn't for another, 10 years. And then it was another period of time before I finally got re-inspired by her story. I went to Checkpoint Charlie, and I saw her picture there, and it was the exact same picture that she'd sent to us in Vancouver, of her leaning up against a tree, looking different from everybody else who'd sent pictures. She looked sexier and more fun, and just more of a renegade. And it just went into me like a seed. The writers who will all recognize this, that moment. Yes, exactly, when a seed drops into you. And so that was the moment that had happened for me. And I just thought, I just walked away out of that museum changed, with that sort of electric feeling. The hairs on my arms were all lit up, and I thought, yeah, I'm going to write about this. I'm going to. And I saw it. I mean, I think I saw the novel in nascent shape. Even then, I think I saw what it was going to become. You had somebody on, somebody was on your show who was talking about that, how the novels are, in a sense, already out in the ether when you're dreaming them. And I felt that anyway. I felt like I could see a lot of what was going to happen, but then it took me years to write it.
Yeah, as it does often.
Yeah.
But, and I heard you speak on another show about your process, about the structure of it too, which is another question. But my second question is, Manfred, the point of view, always a great, sometimes it's a struggle, sometimes it's very clear why we choose a point of view to tell the story. Why him instead of Petra herself?
I did have some very early drafts where she told more of the story. I mean, she does tell a little bit of the story. And I had some drafts where Emil Gerhardt was more of the storyteller. And I think I didn't like it as much as having it siphoned through Manfred. And Manfred came because I sort of fell into him because I was writing it sometimes as a play. And so I had a narrator. I was quite inspired by Peter Schaefer and how he would have a narrative person who would come out, or like Thornton Wilder, they kind of, the guy walks out and starts to tell the story, and then out of his brain the thing starts to get acted out on stage. And then he also has a narrative that interweaves with the narrative that he's telling, so that by the end, you know, it's like Peter Aquis also wrote Amadeus, and you can see how Salieri narrates the story, but is also changed by the story. So that was the kind of inspiration, like structural inspiration or genre inspiration I had to frame it this way. But then I realized somewhere along the line that I really needed Manfred's story, because it differs from Petra's. He makes such different choices. And if we didn't have him as a foil, we'd miss half of what happens. And so I was very glad when I finally realized, oh, that's why I did it that way. There's a narrative need. Mm-hmm.
And you accomplished both, I think, because you hear from her, you hear from him, and it's interconnected, obviously.
It is interconnected. Yeah, I mean, at a certain point, I remember looking at it, I had the different characters on different file cards that were different colors, and I had it posted up on my wall. And there weren't enough Petras. Petra was pink, and I think, you know, Manfred was white, and the general was green. And I remember looking at it and thinking, I've got to weave more of her in, or we're losing her voice. So there are a few places where she just comes through in her own voice and expresses her frustration or her own portion of the story. I kind of, for that, I really do follow the Edith Wharton maxim that you tell, you know, this idea of when do you switch from point of view to point of view in a narrative. And what she says is, you stick to a narrative for as long as you can tell the story from that person's point of view. And when you really, really can't, then you switch, and it makes sense. And so you'll see that in like Henry James or Edith Wharton. Yeah, they actually do. They make the switch because you have to make the switch. You can't tell it if you don't alter the point of view. And I think that readers are surprisingly willing to be fluid around narrative choices. You know, you often think, oh, will they really make that leap into this other person's point of view? But they tend to just do it.
Yeah, well, I think you've mastered it in here just with the other characters as well. Like they're, you know, the minor, nobody's really minor, but the other ones who slip in, and then you hear from them, and it's really well woven. I loved it.
Thank you.
Just your writing, and I know I mentioned this in one of our emails too, where it's just the detail, how you, like, there's a doorknob, and there's the lake, and just these tiny little sentences that just say volumes. It's remarkable.
Oh, thank you.
I don't know if you could speak to that kind, like that's really your voice, your style of writing.
I guess I love writers who do that, so I try to do that myself. I'm very drawn to just the absolute pertinent detail. You know, you try to write like your heroes, and one of my heroes, of course, is Alice Munro. And I admire what she does so much, you know, with the salient detail, and then she leaves the rest. You know, so much goes unsaid, and then she just pokes you with the salient detail. And yeah, so I admire that, and I work to do that myself. And so I cut a lot. I overwrite. I write in the margins. I write all over the place. Like once I finish a draft, I just write all over it. And then I do try to slip back to just what the actual moment requires in terms of the scene. Yeah. And I also, just one other thing, seeing as I know writers are really interested in this fine print, that I'm really interested in how surface details affect symbolism in writing. Like I was really inspired about 20 years ago when I read Flannery O'Connor's Surface and, I'm blanking on it. It's basically about surface and fiction. Mystery and Manners is the name of the book. And it's so fascinating what she said. You know, we're always taught as writers to use detail in fiction, and we're taught it as though detail is just a merely pragmatic issue for a writer. If you add detail, people will believe it more. If you add detail, it'll feel more like life. It's a kind of like an imitative thing. Whereas the way Flannery O'Connor talks about it, when you add detail, you're actually able to go under the story and into the symbolism. And it's only through that that you will actually get the symbolism. So a lake is never a lake. If you touch it, if it glitters, it's different than if it's murky. If it's, if it's covered in ducks, it means something different than if it's got low clouds on it. And so every choice you make actually has a symbolic reverberation into the work. And so when I found that out, I just thought, oh my God, that is so thrilling. And so I think that that's what writers try to do, is they're conscious of the symbolic weight of the choices they make in terms of the surface.
Yeah, it's like permission. You're given permission to do
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
And it's including the right details. I think that's the tricky part.
And figuring out what they are, yeah.
That's what
that. Yeah.
easy to talk about. Yeah. We're gonna get to, it's already 7:25, but interconnectedness. You said that in the piece you read, and this has been a theme, and obviously you didn't predict a global pandemic when you were going to launch this book, so that's a whole other way of launching a book. But the pandemic is in a way interconnected, right? And it's made us perhaps more interconnected than we ever thought we were. Can you speak a bit about that? And I mean, that's part of Indigenous culture and part of the green philosophy. Petra's believed it to her core, right?
Yeah, very much. I mean, it is so beautiful to hear Indigenous voices, speaking about literature or about, on your show. You had Leanne Bedasamosake Simpson, amazing. And she was talking about the interconnections that she weaves as an Indigenous storyteller. And also about, I was just fascinated by that interview, about how she leaves blank space because the elders are silent. And silence doesn't have to mean anything. Anyway, this is an aside to say, thank you for asking that question. I feel that Petra was deeply ahead of her time in terms of seeing as a natural part of her gait as an intellectual, the vast interconnections, and she never dumbed them down. I mean, she just went from here to there to, this was what she saw. And so I think she saw more like a mycelial web, like, there's a lot more talk now about the communication between trees and how they connect through their mycelium, and that this might be how we connect as a species, and also as, as living organisms, is through webs of interconnectivity. And so I think what Petra can lead us to through her vision of interconnectivity that she forwarded so beautifully is a sense that that we are that we are interconnected, and that we shouldn't dumb it down, because cutting it off here or cutting it off there or cutting it off on top because we have to stick to a single message is actually not going to be able to save us. We have to think holistically, and we have to be unafraid to do that. I think is one of the things I feel more and more from this global time. When I think about the threats of climate change, I think that we do need, we need to be able to challenge our leaders to address the whole picture, because a lot of times they don't. I've been reading and doing interviews with Seth Klein, who just came out with his book, A Good War, and he talks about how there's a new climate denialism, is what he calls it, where